Oh. All right, here we go. Good morning, people.
Good morning. Welcome back to A Table for 7 Billion. We've
And
been sitting
growing,
here
and
since last
growing.
week and growing. Yeah, yeah. We've been sitting here the whole time waiting for you to come back. So we're glad you're here. Uh, Man, I'm starving. So
You're
we've got an
starving.
interesting we have an interesting show today. We are
Yes.
going to talk about these. We're
Ooh.
we're going to talk about chopsticks, but talking about chopsticks gets into a whole conversation about how the entire world eats. And it's a very interesting thing. There's a lot of history behind chopsticks.
No way.
And I discovered a lot of history in this cool book here that I have called
Oh,
Chopsticks, an
yeah.
Owner's Manual. It's a fascinating little book. I've had it for years. And it's got great illustrations too. It's got
Oh,
all
it's got
these little,
pictures. It's got
yeah, it's got,
pictures, so I
yeah,
can read it. That's so cool. I'm so
yeah,
excited.
yeah. You can just follow the pictures along.
Well, there
So,
was a lot of things to it, huh? Like we were, I mean,
well,
which one
as
was first, James?
the egg, I think the egg was first. Oh, you mean in terms of eating utensils?
Yeah. No,
Well,
we don't
according to
eat
this
it.
book, yeah. Well, you can eat an egg without any utensils at all. So the first means of eating, of course, around the world in prehistoric times, everybody ate with their hands.
Kenny, okay, we'll shut up
Okay,
for.
Kenny, we'll just sit here quietly until you're done. uh, Yeah, everybody ate with their hands. I mean, that was how humans originally ate. And the first implement that was probably invented would have been the knife, for obvious reasons. We're not equipped as humans to tear the food apart like some of our animal cousins. So we had
And
to
friends.
invent something. Yeah, yeah. And so the knife came along first, and then the world kind of became divided in three different styles of eating that are still prevalent today. Uh, there's hands, and there's pros and cons to each method. Of course, there are still people that eat with their hands. It's very common in Middle Eastern cuisine. Certain kinds of foods are really great to eat with your hands. Even sushi is better to eat with your hands, I think. But there are some obvious advantages and disadvantages of that. The advantages, of course, is that you've always got your eating utensils with you. You don't have to carry any special equipment around. The obvious disadvantage, of course, is that you spend a lot of time making sure your hands are clean, because if they're not, then you can spread germs and disease and make yourself sick. Um, and then there's the knife and fork and spoon, which, um, you know, there aren't a lot of disadvantages to that. This person in the book points out that if you're at a formal party and there's lots of forks and lots of spoons, that it creates anxiety. I
Oh
don't
yeah.
think that's a big problem.
No, but yeah.
Basically, the rule has always been that you start on the outside, so the outside fork is
Yeah.
the first one you
Exactly. Right.
use,
Yeah.
and then you keep moving in. But I think today, unless you're at a state banquet at the White House or something, or at Buckingham Palace, which most of us don't get invited to. I know, Olivier, you get invited to those things all the
Every
time,
day. I
but
just can't find
for
my
most,
my
yeah,
tie.
most of us go to restaurants and there's one fork, one spoon, one knife, and you're fine. Um, but then there's a big portion of the world that uses chopsticks, and that's basically China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Are that, it started in China, then it went to Japan and Korea, because Korea sits right between Japan and China, and
Right.
then eventually filtered down into Vietnam. And other Asian countries didn't take to them. They don't use chopsticks in Thailand, for example, or Malaysia, any of those places. There's even, or India certainly doesn't use them. So it was very specific to those sort of, Eastern Asian countries, although China's huge. But um, there's an old story about how chopsticks were invented, and that was the story of these two poor, very hungry farmers who were tromping about the countryside, and they were starving to death. And finally, in an act of desperation, they stole a big piece of meat from a storeroom in this little village, and they ran away. They ran out into the woods to hide. And of course, they started a fire and were cooking the meat, and they were so hungry and they were so desperate they couldn't wait for the food to cool. So they each grabbed two sticks from the ground and started, pulling the meat off and eating it. And somehow that caught
That's
on.
that's why we love legends.
Right, right. But the interesting thing about chopsticks is whether they came first or whether it all dictated how the cuisine came about. Because of course, if you're eating with
Right.
chopsticks and you don't have a knife at the table, and the reason they didn't have knives at the table was because, there was a time where if you were dining with somebody that you didn't quite trust, you did not want his knife sitting on the table pointed at you. It was a bad position to be in. You didn't want your enemy bringing their knives to the table, and then it just became an issue of manners. It was just considered bad form to have a knife at the table. It was bad juju. So if you're going to eat with chopsticks at the table and no knife, then obviously the food has to be bite size. You have to be able to pick it up and put it in your mouth in one
And
bite.
that's why he was cut bite size. That's why he was cut small.
Right.
So there's
And
no use for
also,
knives at this. Yeah.
Also in China, there were times where food was scarce and fuel for cooking was even more scarce. So if you had to cook, you needed to get the most out of your fuel that you possibly
Right.
could. So
Right.
it became all about the prep. So everything would be cut up into small pieces. So not only would it be easier to eat with your chopsticks, but also it cooked faster. So, and
Right.
that's how the wok came about too, because you could cook things very quickly. You could use a very small amount of cooking oil
Right.
or whatever fat you were using in the pan. You didn't need to cover a whole big broad pan. You just needed a little bit in the bottom. And food cooks very fast in a wok when it's cut up in small pieces, so you conserve your fuel. So we got a lot of comments over here. Frodo says a pinch it. Oh yeah, well they still use those in Japan to teach children how to use chopsticks. They'll put
Wow.
a wad of paper between there and put rubber bands around it so that the kid can they just have to squeeze it.
It's complicated. Yeah. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So so it grew and grew and grew, and eventually some monk traveled to Japan and took the idea with him, and they liked it. And they still use spoons in China and Japan, of course. In fact, typically the way they would eat in China was that everybody would get a small bowl of rice in front of them, and then in the middle of the table there'd be a big pot with some sort of stew in it. So you would reach over and take things out of the pot and eat them, and then you'd eat a bite of rice and you'd eat some more. And that became the norm. There was actually a time in the 80s when the communist government tried to convince the Chinese people to stop using chopsticks and to convert to forks and knives because of this custom of reaching into the communal pot to get your food. They were spreading germs, and so if one person was sick at the table, he would get everybody sick.
Right. Right.
They've kind of well, it was a disaster. They couldn't convince the Chinese people not to use chopsticks. That was never going to happen. So now what they do in formal situations and in restaurants, often they will give people two sets of chopsticks. So one of them is for retrieving the food from the communal pot, and then the other pair is for eating. So that helps. There's also
So
three different kinds of chopsticks. They have these for individual eating. Then they have longer ones in China sometimes because you can reach across the table and get
yeah. Right.
things. And then they have really long ones for cooking. like Kenny was saying, they are great.
Right,
And a lot of times
right.
in
For scrambled,
Chinese cooks, you'll see them using chopsticks in
stir
the wok.
fries, they do
Right,
that. Frying food, I've seen
right.
that a lot.
But
So
they'll typically use a longer chopstick.
yeah, I was looking at this timeline of using utensil, but we've been using utensil for a long time, even though
Yeah,
still today we can eat with our hands in some countries, because basically when I was in Tunisia with as I told you last week or 2 weeks ago, we used to eat with our hands as kids, and we
yeah,
learned that over there. Said we had no choice. And in India, I think a lot of people still eat with their hands, and in lots of places in Africa,
yeah.
because it's not just that, it's also very essential and very important to touch your mouth and your food. But we're losing that because now people are so, worried about everything. But that's what also it's a point that we've separated our food with our mouth and our fingers by using a
Right,
fork. And using a fork in the Renaissance and after the medieval times was because you wanted to separate yourself from the plebe, from the people that eat with their hands. So it
right,
was a sign of education or culture or whatever.
right.
That's so
Even
when you
class. It was a class thing.
so when you look at all this fact that we can, when you talk about history and anything like this, you need to remember. But there is a you need to think of what were they thinking at the time of. This is important to always understand the thinking process and the mind at the time, right? Because uh, at the time the food was scarce, as you said. That means that people would more likely to eat something that was bad because there was not as much choices. Now they were not as worried. They were worried about bad food, of course, because, and I'm going to talk to you about it in a minute. For example, I have this book that a really good friend brought me. I don't know if you can see, but it's the history of the. It's in French. Histoire des peurs alimentaires. History of the fear of the food. So those are all the edits, the bills that have been passed in France since 1200 about controlling the food, the charcutier, the boucher, the people that would serve food. There was a lot of concern at the time, right? But the main concern for people was to eat first. So there was not as many food as today. So it's important to understand that the fear was there, but the fear of dying of hunger was bigger.
Right.
So, right?
Yeah. Also, a
And
lot
as
of
you
those laws were passed before they really understood why food got bad. They didn't understand bacteria and germs, and
they
not that it
knew there was
matters.
they knew
I
it
mean, you sort of
existed.
know instinctively that green meat is not good for you.
Right, and they discovered all this stuff like listeria and E. coli late 1800, like
Hmm.
1880 or something crazy, so or 1870. So it's really late that they understood the concept of those particular bacteria. They knew that food would go back because, as I said, we have a lot of edits. Edit is like a bill in France,
Hmm.
and l'édit de Nantes, l'édit, it's like a new bill, usually made by the king, and that edit was about controlling the food system with the
Yeah.
butcher, the boulanger. So, for example, the butcher could not serve cooked meat, and the bistro or the guy who had an auberge, the restaurant at the time, could not serve raw meat because if he cooks it, that's not his job to butcher meat. So how do we know that meat was not bad? And then again, the butcher has to sell you the food fresh so you can actually smell it and see it's not sick, and then
Right.
cook it yourself on it. And now it's very separate. So yeah, there was an understanding already, right? So it's not new. It's just it keeps evolving in many different ways, and that's why those utensils I've been and I can see here. This is crazy stuff, right? That was used. When was that? This is it. Look at this. 20,000 years ago. It's pretty crazy, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been, it's obviously
So,
people eat it.
so spoons were much earlier than chopsticks, actually, because if you're eating,
Well,
because
spoon
a
is a
lot of people
recipient.
ate
It's kind of,
ate soup.
well, it's kind of easy to understand. It's like because what people need to understand is when you were traveling in Europe in medieval time, all this time, you carry your spoon. It's
Right.
sometimes it's literally as a pendant. so you don't lose it,
Right.
or it's in your bag, and you have a knife and a spoon, or at least a spoon. The knife is
Yeah.
very important, yeah, to cut small stuff. So that was the tool.
Yeah. There's still a lot of people, like say in Korea and other places, they still use spoons to eat rice sometimes, because if you don't eat, if your rice isn't very glutinous and it doesn't stick together, it's pretty hard to eat rice with chopsticks. So they'll use spoons for that. I wanted to respond to Kenny's question here about the origin of the word, because it's very interesting. The first word for them was basically translated to help, because it was to help you eat, but it was too close to the character also meant stop, so there was some confusion there, and then it eventually evolved to it was the boat people actually named him, and I won't say the word in Chinese because I'm sure I'll mispronounce it, but it roughly translated to fast children or quick little boys. It's a weird little name, but it was like quick little boys. And so it eventually morphed in English, because there was this whole thing that they would do this like sort of pidgin Chinese, and to do something quickly was chop chop, do this quick, chop chop. And so they thought that's quick. They thought that meant fast, so they became chopsticks, because they're fast. I don't know
Because
why they were considered so fast, but
yeah, so in the origin of the name, you can already pick sticks. So the sticks are
right,
pretty,
right,
so that's already pretty clear. It's a two
right,
sticks to chop. Well, I guess
right. So so yeah, and of course Chinese cooking evolved into one of the great cuisines of the world. I mean, it's an enormous cuisine,
Oh yeah, oh my God.
and there are like 4 distinct areas in China that have very distinct cooking. They eat a lot of wheat and barley based products in the north. Rice is more prevalent in the south. Very interesting. But I found there's a thing in this book. You'll love this. Uh,
I
this
doubt
was
that.
from these were from these were from records from the early days of the Han Dynasty, which is about 200 BC. And this was a list of quote unquote kitchen help for the imperial Chinese
Oh
kitchen
yeah.
for the emperor. There were 2,000. There were over 2,200 employees. There was 128 everyday chefs,
How many? How
128,
many chefs? I'm sorry. How many chefs?
128, and then 128 more chefs that were just reserved for banquets when they were going to cook a lot of food.
Right.
They had 335 grain, vegetable, and fruit specialists. They had 162 dietitians. That's interesting. 94 icemen, 62 pickle and sauce chefs, and 62 salt men. I mean, that's like
Wow.
what would 62 salt men be doing? I mean, I
Well,
guess
you have to understand how many people they were serving.
yeah, probably an enormous
So
the whole imperial court, so it could have been hundreds of people.
like if you don't go that far, I mean, I understand, the Chinese were super, how do you say that, like very, I'm not going to say high end, that's not the word, very not fancy either, it's really,
Well, a lot of ceremony, a lot of ritual, and
but look at the tea ceremony. I mean, all this thing was, food was very important, and it was made in a
yeah,
really nice and beautiful way, and they were into artistry and stuff like that, very elevated, that's the word I was
right.
looking for, very for the time. Now when you realize I lost my track. Sorry, man.
Well, it also went back and forth through the ages, because one dynasty would be very much into, ivory chopsticks and lots of ceremony and lots of fancy feasts, and then the next they would get overthrown, and the next dynasty would come in and they'd say,
Right,
no, 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 those
right,
people,
right.
they were way too
Yeah,
egotistical.
right.
We need to be more simple, more common. So they would throw out a lot of these traditions, and then eventually the
But
traditions would come
this
back.
James has not gone away. It's the same thing
No,
everywhere. When you look at, for example, my friend in Morocco, in Marrakesh, is the owner of something called La Fantasia. It's a big village for tourists, and They have like, I don't know how many people, 600 people a day or something. It's a big village. They do this horse race. It's beautiful. It's so much fun. And he's the one who makes the food for the king when the king travels. When the king, le roi du Maroc, the king travels in the desert for an event, for a party, for whatever, there is 2,000 people following him.
Wow.
So what happened is all the cooks and all the chefs and everybody, he leaves 1 to 2 days before. They set up the camp. They cook all the food
Yeah.
in advance. And then the king comes and with all these 2,000 people and they enjoy and have fun and stuff like that, right? So it's the same principle is how many people are we serving? So of course you need a lot of the staff if you want to do something really precious like all these people are doing. When you look at the, the castles and we have some of the accounting from the castles in the medieval times also, and you see the how many people working in the kitchen, it's at least 200 people. So this is why in the after the revolution there was so many chefs and cooks
Right.
in the street because there was so many people have been trained in those restaurants in those castles to serve so many banquets. So I think the system has not changed much. Huh? It's like
And they could afford to do that back then because they didn't pay these people anything. I
James,
mean, yeah.
you're
Did I
we
go
I can't
away?
hear you. Are you
Oh
plugged
no.
correctly?
Let me see. Yeah, I think so. Let me see. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Can you
No.
hear me? Nope. Oh my
Barely. The
gosh.
sound is really low.
Let me turn my volume up. Can you hear me better now?
You must have touched something. Don't touch
Yeah.
anything.
How about now?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Okay. Um, but they didn't pay these people anything, or they paid them very, very little because, of course, the staff lived on premises and they got fed, so they didn't really have to pay them much. Today, if you were going to have that big a staff, it would be a fortune because we
Yeah.
actually pay people a living wage. And of course, I've done banquets. I've worked catering where we've served 2,000 people, and we didn't have anywhere near that number
No,
of
I know.
staff in the
Right.
kitchen.
You
It's
can't.
crazy. It's
Also,
crazy.
food is made in advance. In kitchen that are way more modern. You don't need that many people to do that much food nowadays with the
Right.
machine we have today. I mean, I have an oven at the kitchen in the big kitchen. It cooks like I don't know how many chicken at once in perfect, like I don't know how many, like at least 100
Right.
easily. You just see, what I mean, it's not the same. It's not the same tool and the same knowledge that we have today. People are trained. It's a different thing.
Right.
Yeah.
The which brings me to another point. The early Chinese kitchen, one of the advantages to the cuisine was that they required very, very little equipment. The typical Chinese kitchen would have a cleaver, would have some sort of a pot for cooking, or they'd have a wok, and then maybe a pot for cooking rice or cooking, stews and things. So it was a very, very simple kitchen. And I read that in some of the earliest instances, they actually cooked the rice similar to how you sometimes cook couscous today, where you have a pot that the bottom of the pot is some sort of stew that's simmering away with meat and vegetables and things in it. And then there's another pot that sits on top that would be full of rice, and that would cook while the stew was cooking. So that by the time they were both done, then you would combine them. And yeah, there's a Chinese cleaver. The Japanese kitchen evolved much more. They used a lot more implements. They had unlike the pesky French. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, compare that to a typical French professional kitchen where there's so many pots and pans, so many knives. That's the other thing. The Japanese, they typical Japanese kitchen would have many knives because there were knives for cutting sushi, there were knives for
Right.
slicing things thinly, there were knives for chopping, there were other knives. Whereas the Chinese would do it all with a cleaver. People that are really good with a cleaver, it's an amazing tool.
Right. You have to also add to that, and I know it's going to be people are going to bitch about it, but people took way more pride in their work in the old days. That's for
yeah,
sure. I can see it myself in my job, and so they were very into the precision and having a knife for everything because even if it doesn't do anything different from any knife, it's the mindset. They are very involved and they want to do the best that is possible. They had the best tool for everything. It's a mindset. It's like, how do you make better? How do you achieve betterness in your kitchen? That's the thing.
Hmm.
So you see, I mean, it's like now we're gonna use the tool for everything. That's what I would do, right? But again, I'm trying to cook for family, cooking as fast as I can so I can feed my family or teach people how to do that. So use less tools, right? But
Hmm.
we're not in the same business. I'm not working for a king or some fancy person. I'm doing something so I can feed myself. This is a very different aspect.
Sure, sure. And Japanese cooking, of course, evolved to be very much about the aesthetics. Everything was served separately,
Right. Yeah.
and it was all they made it so that everything, each individual thing was beautiful. Japanese cuisine is probably the most beautiful presentation of a cuisine in the world. I mean, everything is just so precise and
Right.
pretty, and the little accents, and it's very minimalist, but it's very, very pretty.
And you see that you don't eat a lot. It's small plates in general. You don't
Yeah,
serve those gigantic food like we've had in Europe or in
right,
America or any other Western countries.
right,
It's
right.
much more, and they're smaller. They're thin. You don't see. I mean, you don't see a lot of fat Japanese people or
Uh-huh.
Chinese. I mean, Chinese. Some like it depends where you are because now everybody's eating really crappy food around the world, right? So now
Well,
everybody's big.
it's changing in Japan a lot because of, do you know that McDonald's in Tokyo uh, sells more hamburgers than any other McDonald's outlet in the world?
Just, it's sad, huh?
And
I mean, seriously. And then you get people going at McDonald's. I have a McDonald's on my street on São Paulo, and there's a line. And I'm like, what are people not understanding exactly? I don't get it.
well, the minister of culture or the minister of, I don't know, education or something in Japan came out, and they'd done a study, and they said that like 40% of Japanese students couldn't use chopsticks. Um,
I
and
mean, that's
and
possible.
well,
It's possible. I can see that.
but
I
one of
can
the
see that.
reasons is they eat a lot of fast food. They eat, hamburgers and sodas and things like that. So they're not
Well,
cooking so much traditional food at home.
then, James, we're going back to the same history about the sandwich, right?
Right. Yeah.
The finger food. I mean, the finger food. And in the medieval time, there was something called tourte. You don't. There's the sandwich was a tourte. It was a pastry that was filled with meat and potatoes and whatever they had at the time. That's what kind of like the idea of the sandwich is a tourte. And I know, James, we talked about the sandwiches. That was really cool because that's the same kind of subject in a way, right?
Uh-huh.
Serbian
Yeah.
cleaver. What is it? Huh?
Uh,
What's a Serbian cleaver?
what's a what? Serbian. There's a lot of. Have you guys seen the supposed Serbian cleavers? They look pretty cool, but I don't know if they're really Serbian. There's a lot of
Oh,
heft.
these guys, I don't know. I try those. I don't. Let me show you guys. I try those. It's weird. It's a weird in hand. It's really weird stuff. Let me show you to you what it is. Um, Kind of the shape like this, right?
Oh yeah, I've seen those.
Yeah, it's kind of it's the same as the Chinese cleaver. It's the same thing. It's a large blade. That's what you need.
Yeah. It
They're a
looks
little
more like,
uncomfortable for me. They're just weird. It's just too small in the. I like the cleaver because it's straight. You can just go for it.
yeah.
That
The
rocking motion with that guy is too difficult for me.
Yeah, typically a Chinese cleaver, the blade is straight, so you can go down and chop. And also the Chinese cleaver, the one of the things I've always thought was an advantage to it was it doubles as a counter scraper. So once you've chopped
Oh
all
yeah,
your
right.
cabbage, then you can just scoop it up. And I mean, you can do that with a cook's knife, a French style cook's knife too, but it doesn't hold as much. So a cleaver, you just scoop it all up and it goes in the wok or whatever. Um, so
What is
there's
that?
also a
We
lot
also
written
what
about.
is a dry? What is it? A dry flatbread? They added this. Oh yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. You do that in French cooking too. Put a crouton in the bowl and add something on top of it. Um,
the onion soup. the traditional onion soup.
Yeah.
Oh shit! What am I doing? So we have to use.
So
We have to show them how to use chopsticks also, huh?
yeah, I was going to give a little lesson.
I have a little video also, chef, if you want to.
There's also a whole list of do's and don'ts with. Let me see. See if I can find it here. Do's and don'ts. Oh, here they are. Chopstick taboos. Do not eat with
Ooh,
a broken
yeah.
or mismatched pair of chopsticks. Do not begin eating without greeting others at the table, except in Korea, where there is usually no one else at the table and you are supposed to be quiet. That's an interesting thing, too. In Korea, traditionally, there was no specific place in the house for dining. People ate wherever they wanted to. So typically, and there was a hierarchy. So the food would be prepared, and typically the master of the house and maybe the son would be served first, but the master would be in his room and the son would be in his room. And then the women would eat somewhere else. So they ate wherever they felt like it, basically. Wherever they were, they would eat. And so there was no specific place. And it was considered bad form to make noise when you were eating. So people sat by themselves and ate very quietly. And you focused on the food. Whereas in China, of course, it's a very much a communal thing, and people are around a table and they're
Right.
talking and they're chatting. And in Japan also, people sit down and share meals together, and there's a specific place in the house to dine. So it's interesting. Do not eat twice in a row from the same dish, except your rice bowl, which doesn't count. So there'd be all these, like if you go to a Chinese restaurant where they bring you a whole bunch of different stuff, you take one thing from each bowl and then you can go back and start over again, but you don't eat the same thing twice. I don't know why. Maybe because you're going to hog it and everybody needs to get some of it. I don't know. Do not hover over dishes trying to decide what to take. That's an interesting one
Oh
that would
wow,
even be
yeah.
written
No,
down. I mean, people like,
because you first of all, it's not polite to refuse any dish. Like for example, in Arabia, you need to eat the stuff that they
yeah,
give you because that's it.
yeah,
That's otherwise they're gonna be offended, and that's
right,
kind of normal, right? But that's how it works. Is because you want to, you spent all this time cooking and stuff. You want the guests to try everything.
right.
I'm assuming that's what it is, right?
Do not dig under your food with your chopsticks to get the best pieces. Um,
Oh man, that's not. We cannot do that.
Giving her homemade miso soup blew her mind. Oh yeah,
Nice.
miso soup is one of the great soups of the world. Do not lick your chopsticks. Uh,
So how do
do
you
not.
like? Well, how do you eat
Well,
that?
you take your food off of it, but then you don't. If there's sauce on your chopsticks, you don't. Do not eat with your face bent over the plate like a dog. Do not push food directly into your mouth from the bowl. And in Korea, you don't even lift your rice bowl off the table. Now, in in some cultures, in China and Japan, the rice bowl is lifted, and they kind of,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's hard to eat rice with chopsticks. If it's very
Especially,
glutinous rice and it's all stuck together, you can
well,
pick up clumps of it. But if
especially
it's
the
if
uncooked
it's
rice, man.
separate,
The uncooked rice is impossible.
yeah. So when I
Woo!
count my rice with the chopsticks, I have
I
to
know.
do it.
Well, the worst is when you forget your count and you have to start again. That's like,
Oh, do not stab food with your chopsticks. Do not touch food with your chopsticks without eating it. Do not use chopsticks as toothpicks. That's interesting. I don't, this is kind of thick. I don't think I could use that as a toothpick.
oh my god.
Do not hold chopsticks in your mouth while using your hands. Do not scratch your head with chopsticks. Do not
Yeah.
stick chopsticks in your rice.
What
And
about in your nose?
that
Like
has to do
Halloween.
with, yeah, you can stick them in your nose. You can do this.
That's fun.
Um,
I like that.
but in some cultures, at the funeral, there's a bowl of rice with a pair of chopsticks stuck in it, and that indicates the death of someone. So you don't do that at
Whoa.
table because it's bad form. And you don't set your chopsticks on the bowl on your bowl or dishes. You always place them on the table on a little chopstick holder or something. They even have elaborate rules in traditional Japanese dining, is that you do things like you pick up the chopsticks with your right hand, you transfer them to your left hand, and then you fit them into your hand, and it's all very complicated. But
So
anyway, I'm going to give a little lesson in how to use chopsticks, because
and
I sort
also
of
that's also that I've heard you can't like rub them like this, or you know when they do that when
yeah,
right.
sometimes people do that with the disposable chopsticks. And speaking of disposable chopsticks, I wanted to get into that discussion too. But
Yeah,
um, but
let's talk about
first,
that.
they say that the best chopsticks overall are bamboo, which is what these are made of. These are Japanese style chopsticks. You can
Right.
see that it comes to a point on the end. It's a little wider on this end. Uh, Chinese chopsticks tend to be fatter on the end and round, because they pick up a lot of noodles and things like that. And there's another chopstick that I used to sell, and I didn't understand the difference. But sometimes you see them, and they've got little ridges on the end. They've got a whole strip of little ridges that go all the way around. Those are noodle chopsticks. They make it much easier to pick up noodles because it sort of clings better. Anyway, so what you want to do, you want to hold your hand like
Oh,
this. And oh, by the way, the Japanese say that the ideal chopstick for you is the distance from the base of your hand to the top of your middle finger. It should be 1.2 times that. So mine is just about that. It's
how do you
one
know that?
point.
How do you calculate? How do you even calculate that?
I'm just guessing. So here's what you do. You want to hold your hand like this. You stick the chopstick in between your thumb and your hand and hold that. And then with this finger, you hold that. So now the bottom chopstick typically does not move. It doesn't move in the hand. It only moves as your hand moves. Otherwise it's solid, it's rigid. The other chopstick goes up there in here, and then with your middle finger, you hold it like this, almost like you'd hold a pencil. And that's the chopstick that moves. So when you're picking up food, the bottom one stays solid, and the top one moves
Right.
up and down like that, like a little alligator clip. So, and you get used to chopsticks. I find chopsticks really great. We have a whole crock full of these bamboo chopsticks because they're really great if you serve salad as a separate course. They're really great for eating salad. And then we cook Asian food. Sometimes we cook stir fries and things, so we often will use our chopsticks
Right.
just to get into the swing of it. But what is the oldest person you've ever seen who still couldn't work chopsticks? Probably my mother, and she's 97.
Oh yeah.
I'm
Right.
I'm seriously doubting she knows how to use chopstick. Maybe she does. Maybe she'd surprise me.
So
But
James, I have a little video to how to use chopsticks. Let's see if you were right.
I like to pick flies out of the air. I like to snatch flies when they come by.
Oh
How to use
no.
chopsticks. Teach you something really important and handy, which is how to use chopsticks. She sounds just like me.
She doesn't look the same though.
No, she's much prettier.
Let's see if James was right. Let's see if James lied.
I'm gonna reach over and
Ooh, ooh,
grab
ooh,
her.
ooh, 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 ooh.
Wait, go this way. Boop. Okay. She's doing a lot of talking about chopsticks. More showing, less talking. Look, she's doing it like me.
Nice job, man. Look at you. Whoa. James was telling the truth, people.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so the one.
So you're right, man.
Do I get an A?
You know what we did? We fact checked your
Yeah. So
James has been fact checked, so we need a little blue thing, like a little blue, accepted.
So disposable chopsticks.
Yes.
Let me find the chapter on that. There's a whole thing about it, and it's very interesting because apparently some guy invented them, and he invented them because he was somewhere and didn't have any chopsticks. He'd forgotten to
Anytime now.
bring
Huh?
his chopsticks.
Anytime now.
He had forgotten to bring his chopsticks, so somebody in the town gave him a little piece of wood, a little piece of cedar, and he carved his own, but he left them connected at the top, and then he could break them apart when he was going to use them, and it caught on, and then they started making them. They started production on them to sell them to people, and it became a huge thing. To the point where they now sell, they make something like, oh my God, they make something like, estimates vary greatly, but Japan alone uses somewhere between 13 and 25 billion pairs of disposable chopsticks each year, which represents somewhere between 120 and 200 million cubic feet of lumber, enough to build over 10,000 homes. So
Wow.
disposable chopsticks have become they've become a real controversy. I used to think that they were just made out of scrap wood. So you go to a lumber yard, you go to a carpentry shop, and they've always got scraps of wood laying around that were too small to do anything with, and that they would use those. But when you figure they're making billions and billions of chopsticks, you know they're buying wood to do this. So it's
and you also know, you also know they're eating. That's good.
right. They are eating. So a lot of people recommend now that you take your own chopsticks with you if you go to some place that uses disposable chopsticks, and to not use them. It's a real big thing. There's a thing in Japan called the Japan Tropical Forest Action Network that has worked hard to try to get people to not rely on disposable chopsticks. It's
Right.
it's a great environmental hazard. It may have been a good idea at one time, but when you start getting into the
Wow.
hundreds of billions of chopsticks, it
Yeah.
becomes a
I
real
mean, and
problem.
that's what disposable, that means like twice a day or 3 times a day, right? I mean,
Yeah. Bamboo shortage in China, I don't know about that. I wouldn't be surprised. Anything that you farm to that degree is going to be in short supply.
I thought that was
So
because of the koalas.
I read there's a bamboo shortage, and that's because of disposable chopsticks. They
I
usually
thought
don't
there
make
was,
disposable chopsticks out of bamboo. They're usually like a cheap white
but you
softwood.
said they do chopstick with bamboo, and that might be the
Yeah.
same. People, I don't think people keep them for a long time, anyways,
Well,
right? I mean,
well, see, that's the thing about bamboo chopsticks, is that they are incredibly durable. Like these chopsticks I'm holding in my hand, I could pass these down through generations, and people do. They often
I don't
inherit
think
the
people are going to want that, but sure. It's like, did you put that in your mouth? Was it a brand new one or no?
Well, they would inherit silverware. What's the difference? I mean, it gets washed. I mean, we have a crock full of these, so I'm not using the same ones every time. I'm using the ones that somebody else has used, but they get washed, they get sanitized. So, but they're really durable. These, I mean, this will definitely last me my lifetime. I will never have to replace these unless I lose them.
And you can't just replace one of them.
That's right.
Yeah, yes,
It's like
that's the thing. If you lose
I was
one, you
walking
lose both.
around with a chopstick one day, and someone asked me, they said, did you find a chopstick, or did you lose one? Uh, sometimes you know what else we use them for? When something gets stuck in the toaster, it's, of
Oh
course,
yeah,
it's never a good idea to put a metal utensil in the toaster, even if you
it's
unplug it.
not.
So we use chopsticks.
So no metal in the toaster, right? That when it's
Well, not
plugged, you mean?
unless you've had enough of life and you want to end it. I mean, of course, we always unplug it if something gets stuck in there, but still, we use chopsticks, and it's just easier because they're
I
thin.
do that in
You
my
can reach.
bathtub. This is why I have time to fix my electronics. It's a
Yeah,
relaxing time, right?
yeah. You have a little table across the tub that you put the thing, and then you keep them plugged in so you can see if they're working yet. Of
Well, yeah,
course.
because you have to try. But they're
Yeah.
not touching the water, so you have to worry
No.
about it. It's just like
No.
it's above the water. It's not. I'm safe. I'm not stupid.
Okay. So if you don't show up for the
Okay.
if you don't show up for the podcast one day, we'll know that you had an accident in the tub. All right. Very good.
One of the tools fell down.
Yeah. So there's also omens about chopsticks. Of course, superstitions arose, and it has to do with children. They say that women that hold their chopsticks really far down are less likely to have children than when they hold them up here. That, of course, must be true. That seems like scientific fact. Um,
Don't involve science in that, please,
had
because I'm
a
going to want to see the
conversation.
study. I need to see the ergonomic studies. We need to see all this. So no, don't talk about science unless you have something to support it. Okay.
So Kenny's using some big words here. He talked to his
Yeah,
daughter
I'm
about
trying to.
perturbation and turbulence. He's got a really bright daughter, obviously, but
Yeah, if we
uh,
can't even understand those words, well, she's 8 years old, so she's going to school. We don't,
yeah,
right?
that's true. We don't go to school, so she's probably smarter than us. In Japan and in China, both, they sometimes will make really huge pairs of chopsticks as ceremonial offerings or as gifts to someone. They're usually gifts to the gods of one sort or another. Um, uh, and then, or they'll make a special pair as a gift for somebody. There was a story about some emperor who came to this banquet, and they had uh, like gold chopsticks, silver chopsticks, or something for him, and he refused to sit down at the table because he thought that was too extravagant. So until they replaced it with a simple bamboo pair of chopsticks, he wouldn't sit down and eat, which I thought was pretty egalitarian of him. Plus, they sometimes
Yeah,
make metal chopsticks, but they don't feel good in your mouth. You don't want to
they
put
taste
metal.
they taste weird. They taste
Yeah,
metallic and cold and weird, and
yeah, especially.
it's like those metal straw they give sometime in restaurants. It's so weird. Oh my god.
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
pepper straw. Jesus, what the hell?
yeah. And gold chopsticks became a thing for a while too. But the thing about gold chopsticks is that they're very heavy. So you're just like struggling to hold these things. And I like these. These are my favorite chopsticks ever. I've used Chinese ones too, which are fine. Um, hate metal chopsticks.
I want chopstick with like rubber, like silicone protection, so I can go in the oven with it. I want the new one.
Yes.
Anyway,
Um,
so eating with your hand, or with a spoon or with a fork, right? The fork came what from Italy? I mean, it came. It was very old, but it came with it from Italy, right? The Italians
well,
started to do that
that's
first.
that's where it went to the rest of Europe, was from Italy. I'm not sure who actually invented it. There was some talk that there
Well,
there was some sort of fork-like instrument in China that they would use for pasta, but I don't know if that's true or not.
because what
Um,
happened in Italy or in Europe right after the medieval times. So the medieval times is kind of between the 500 and the 1400 or
mhm,
somewhere like that. And after that, it's called La Renaissance. Renaissance is right after that, and Italian were very big in Renaissance, and all they've done is went back to their ancestral Roman style, which is
right.
all taken from the Greeks. So basically, you have this Renaissance. Everybody's back to that, the columns, the Greek style. They call that the Roman style, but these Romans took it from the Greek originally. So we're
Mhm,
back to that, exuberance of food and forks, and this is where we're starting to differentiate and start to also classify it more, because now we have also something new. We have a what is this called? Middle class. The middle class is
right.
growing, that never existed before, because now you have people with a little bit of money that are above the peasants, and they contribute to the city's finances. So now they have a little bit of more of a say to say too. So, and those were called the middle class, the bourgeois, from the
Mhm,
bourg. The bourg is the town. The bourgeois was the people that live in the bourg, in the nice area of the town. They were the boulanger, the butcher, the charcuterie, all these people with profession, all the trades, they were starting to accumulate wealth a little bit, right? So they become a power on their own, and they started to differentiate themselves, and they started to mingle with the aristocrat because they had the money, and a lot of times aristocrats were poor. They had all the lands, but they would spend all their money in wars and stupid stuff like that. So they rely on bankers, like the Jews, for example, were important bankers at the time, and they rely on everybody that would loan them money, and they had exchange, so they could gain status, social status, from from having this extra wealth.
Right. And the
Or
Jews
like the
often,
wool, the wool, for example, one great example is the plant. Which one is the Plantagenet? Uh, they became super rich with wool, for example, from
right.
the Dutch, right? Was the
Uh-huh.
Plantagenet or what? Anyway, so this is how it works, right? All these middle class people become more important, and you can see after the revolution that's called le tiers état, the third state. It's the
Right.
aristocrat, the church, and the tiers état, and
And for the first time, they had a little bit of extra, what we now call disposable income, so they could do things
well,
like
that's what I was saying about the wealth.
they could buy nice forks, and they could buy nice plates, and
They can also be more with the aristocrat. They would
yeah,
have, like, they would start to mingle more, and that create that class. And that, if even after the revolution we've seen that happening again, exactly the same system that was from that period.
hmm yeah. And of course, the Jews got into banking because they were restricted from many of the guilds. They weren't allowed to be in so many of the artisan guilds for
And
some
also the
stupid.
one, I mean, from what I understand, one of the things that the Jews were good learners is um, because they would follow the Torah. They have a contract, so it's one of the religion with the religion is very set up with the contract. This is what they do. This is how they behave. So that
hmm
was kind of a contract, a good faith of like how they will operate. So they were trusted for that, but they got ripped off so many times because they had no power, right? They just
Right.
could loan money. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And yeah, and often if they loaned money to somebody and the person didn't pay them back, they
they would
sometimes, depending on where
chase
they
them.
were, they didn't have recourse. They couldn't take
They
them
would
to
they were
court.
chased from the country. Usually that's what happened. When
Yeah.
the people owed too much money, they would just chase them. But it's not just the Jews; it's anybody with money.
Yeah.
One of the example was the Crusader, no, the Knights, the Templars.
Yeah.
The Templars was extremely rich, and the king could not pay it back, and they wanted all this money, so they went after them. It's always distorted, huh? It's like the man, it's like these people. Anyway, so we have about 7 minutes, James. So that was great.
I
That's
did
fun.
learn one other interesting thing in this book about, I didn't really understand what the Shinto religion was, which is the primary religion in Japan. And I love this. It's one of the only religions of its time anyway that didn't have any real gods. It was all about nature. It was all about learning about and respecting and
Yeah,
worshiping nature, which is also what the pagans were doing in Ireland
and the Buddhist.
and the Buddhists. Yeah, it wasn't about worshiping a person, a god, or a figure. It was about relishing nature and being in the rhythm with nature, which is so important and which we've lost so much of. They built a pretty remarkable city in the form of Valletta in Malta.
Yeah,
I
they've been
believe you,
all
Kenny.
over. So if people don't know what Templars are, those are the monks that took arms to defend the Crusades. So there was a whole core of a group of new military group that is called the Templars. They were monks, and they learned how to fight, and they built an army to go defend the Crusades, right? That started in
Right.
1100 or something.
Because the because Jerusalem is sort of ground zero for the
Yeah,
Christian religion, but
right.
it's also ground zero. It's one of the main places for the Muslim religion and
Yeah.
also um, Judica. So it's interesting that the world's three biggest
I
religions
know.
are all centered on this one
Yeah,
city, and they fight over it all the time. So the Crusades were
non-stop.
all about, because the basically the Muslims, or uh, the Turks, the Moors, whatever they called them, were
No, it was
pretty much in
it.
charge of Jerusalem, and so they were outraged that this Catholic, or this very Christian epicenter, was in the hands of what they considered.
Saladin was one of
Yeah,
the main character of that. But the yeah, it's Islam. Islam religion was gaining. Like Christianity and Islam were trying to get as
right,
much power as they could, both of them in the same kind of way. And the Crusader, all the kings, the church needed something to get. If in order to make money in a government, if you don't work, you need to go and get it. You need to
right,
go attack a country. That's the way it's been always like this.
right,
So they need money. They need stuff for the war. That war was incredibly expensive, and they had to make sure they could pay all this. So they would go and get all the and rampage all the cities as they go over there, right? And as they come back, they do the same. They rampage and they get all type of gold and diamond and try to reinforce their strength, their financial strength. But it's always been like that. There's nothing changed until now it's all hidden in some different pretext.
and
But
it was all done in the
and
name of God, in the name of their religion. We have to go defend the city of Jerusalem against
right,
these.
and
They
there was a
weren't
lot of people, and the thing is, there was those lords and aristocrats, but there was a lot of regular people. Tons
Yeah,
would go to Jerusalem to on a how do you call that when you go on a
when you go on it. Yeah,
pilgrimage, right?
yeah.
And
I
some
mean,
of these
you
people had
figure
no
if
money
you
at all. They were just doing day by day. It's crazy.
right, right. Well, if you were traveling with the king, you'd probably get fed, and the
It's the
chances
court
are,
only the court, only this is the thing. The court has his own kitchen, his own people, and then everybody else they're on their own. It's a
yeah,
huge court of people, and just people figure it out, and usually at the cost of the country that they cross. Everybody that they cross, they
right,
just pick from that most of the time,
right. They
right?
would just,
Sometimes they were
and
invited, but
most of the time they just took what they wanted, because they were all armed, of course, and there was lots of them.
so we're almost done. But one of the person that understood that pretty well was Napoleon and his army, right? Um, he understood very well that the food is to be very important, but the Romans also was very organized with the food, and
Right,
so you can see that the military needs food in order to do conquest. You need to have a system, and a lot of time the food was following the army or going in ahead of the army. So you could
right.
see that from a very old time. Anyway,
The
well, that was
question,
great, man.
the question
Yes,
is,
answer.
did Napoleon ever use chopsticks? I'm guessing
Who
no.
knows?
Yeah, who knows? There's
He,
also a very interesting chapter in this book on Marco Polo, who,
Marco Pollo.
yeah, he didn't. He was an interesting guy. He probably saw things that he didn't even write about, because he said he didn't write about half of what he saw, because some of it no one would have believed him. They would have
Smart
thought
man,
he was
smart
making
man.
it up. So, but
All right, James, that was a good one. This is now we have a new software that works really well. I'm very happy about it. As you can see, nothing broke. Everything went well.
yeah, well, that's because I've got a new antenna.
The
So
wood antenna, the wooden
yeah,
antenna, those are the
yeah,
best.
yeah.
All right,
So
people. Well,
thank you for
thank
joining
you.
us. Thanks
Thank
to
you,
all of
everyone.
our people that have put comments in. Basically, Kenny and Frode. Kenny's got way too much time on his hand, don't you think?
Yeah, really.
We want to hear some comments from your daughter, Kenny. Don't hog the keyboard
All
all the
right,
time.
we gotta go, man.